Welcome, everybody. My name is April Starr, and I'm a Director of Training and Quality Assurance for Big Brothers Big Sisters. I think everybody we have with us today are staff, so that's cool. Please excuse my voice. I'm still getting over illness, and I may have to stop and take a drink or cough every once in a while. And hopefully my voice will not give out by the end of this. So as I started last year during the month of April, I'm continuing to update you guys on the trends in child abuse and neglect in the United States and in Texas. I do this during the month of April because April is National Child Abuse Prevention Month. So this is a very appropriate topic for this month of the year. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what we're going to look at today is how are abuse and neglect data reported. What data is reported and how do they use it? We'll look at the national data from the Child Maltreatment 2014 report, which is last year's, yes, 14. We'll discuss that in a minute. We'll look at the Texas data from CM 2014 and the state trends from that year. We're also going to look at this next year's report, so looking at the national data, the Texas data, and the state trends, and then we'll have a little discussion about that. So how is child maltreatment reported in the United States? So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Child Bureau collects data from Child Protective Services agencies from all of the states, local areas, tribal agencies, and all 50 of the states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. They compile this into the Child Maltreatment Report, which has been released each year since 1992. Child Maltreatment 2014 is representative of data collected starting in the federal fiscal year 2014, so from September 2014 to August 2015. And the Child Maltreatment 2015 is the same way. It starts in the federal fiscal year September 2015 and goes to August 2016. So this is the most recently compiled data by the federal government, and they take a few months after the fiscal year to compile that in the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. So it all goes from the CPS from all the different areas into NCANs, and then at the end of the year they take everything out of NCANs and they compile it, they analyze it, and they create the Child Maltreatment Report, which is published in January of every year for the previous federal fiscal year. So our 2015 report, the one that starts with the 2015 data and ends in 2016, is published. It was published on January 19th of this year. So what data is reported and how do they use it? So once an allegation, which they call a referral of abuse or neglect, is received by CPS, so once someone either goes online or calls in to the hotline, it's screened by CPS to see if it's something that needs to be opened as a case or not. So it's either what they call screened in or screened out. If it's once it's screened in, a referral is then called a report, and that report is assigned to a CPS caseworker. And then the caseworker works that report to determine what's going to happen with it. So they have to respond to all of those reports. If it's been screened in as a report, it can't be set aside. It has to be assigned to a caseworker, and that caseworker has to evaluate what's going on and make recommendations based on that evaluation. And further monitoring will happen if that needs to. All of those reports and their outcomes of the reports are collected and reviewed in NCANs. So case level data, including the information about the characteristics of the reports. So we're talking about demographic information, and also what type of like abuse or neglect it is. So we learn about the children involved, what they did with it, the perpetrators, the risk factors of the child and the caregivers that were involved in reports, the services that were provided. All those things are collected and analyzed. So it's a very, very large report, as you can imagine. There's a huge narrative portion, and then there's just pages and pages of tables of data as well. So aside from the CM report, NCANS also uses this information in their child and family services reviews, and they have a report that they give to Congress every year called the Child Welfare Outcomes. And this basically is a way for them to measure several federal programs that impact child welfare overall in the United States. So the Child Welfare Outcomes does not just include data from NCANS, it also includes data from things like Medicaid services, family assistance services, Medicare, and things like Social Security services as well. Kind of everything government-wise that touches kids under 18 kind of gets compiled into that welfare outcomes report to Congress. Organizations that are concerned with child welfare and safety have used numbers to basically come up with some relevant statistics that are kind of very helpful for everyone in general. Just dialing down through all of that massive amount of data. What are some highlights of what people who work with child welfare and safety really need to pay attention to? So for the fiscal year 2014, the estimate of victims based on reports was 702,208. So a little over 700,000 reports that were referred on. The majority of victims consist of 3 races or ethnicities. The major ones are white, Hispanic, and African American. You can see a very large portion are white, about double the portion of both Hispanic and African American. You can see that the African American and Hispanic numbers are pretty close. A continuing trend is that the greatest percentage of kids suffered from neglect and physical abuse. So about 65% of suffered from neglect in 2014, starting in 2014, and about 15% physical abuse. It's estimated that nationally about 1,500 kids die from abuse and neglect every year. That's a very sad statistic. More than half of the perpetrators of any abuse or neglect are women, and not quite half are men. 78% of the perpetrators are parents. And when you think about neglect being the highest percentage of reports, that makes sense. And only 2.8% of perpetrators were unknown to their victim in 2014 report, which is important for us to understand servicing kids, because I think a lot of people think of perpetrators of abuse, people automatically think of pedophiles, sexual abusers, and think of them as the creepy dude that lives down the street, you know, that just kind of kidnaps kids and abuses them. or lures them in with candy and abuses them or something, but that's just not the reality. Most kids are not abused by those. I mean, those people exist, but most kids are not abused by those type of people. So the Texas-specific data that started in 2014 is that the estimate for our victims reports in Texas is about 65,000. The majority of our victims in our state are Hispanic, followed fairly closely by white, and quite a few less African American victims, like half of the white number of white victims. So you could see very large portion Hispanic in this state. The greatest percentage of children suffer neglect and abuse. You can see that they are in line pretty much exactly with the national numbers. We had 153 deaths reported due to neglect and abuse. And of note that for 2014, that is the highest number of deaths for all of the states. All of the reporting entities, so that includes DC and Puerto Rico. 43% of perpetrators in our state were men, and 56 were women. That's pretty close to the national numbers for that year. And 78% were parents in Texas as well, pretty close to the national number. Less than 1% were unknown to the victim in Texas, so that's a whole percentage point plus less than the national average. So that's of note, I think. So some trends from our state in 2014. Texas was approximately 10% of the reported victims for the entire U.S., which is quite a lot. I mean, we're talking about 50 states. So you've got 52 reporting areas, right? You've got 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, and we are 10%. I mean, we're definitely not 10% in number as far as how many reporting areas there are. It's important to keep in mind our population size too, though. So while in the U.S. the largest number of victims were white kids, the largest racial group of victims in Texas are Hispanic. And it's worth noting that our percentage of Hispanic victims is double the national average of Hispanic victims. I think also you need to look at our demographic across the state in general when you think about that. We have a very large Hispanic population here. Texas also comprised 10% of the fatalities, so that kind of lines up with our number of reports. Sadly, we didn't. Our fatalities were not a lesser percentage of our reports. And of course, that was the highest number of fatalities reported by any state, which makes sense when we look at the fact that we are the highest, kind of have a high number of reports. So now we're going to move along to the report from 2015. So this is the one where the data ends in August of last year. So this is our most recent data. Organizations that collected this data and brought some highlight points through for us showed these things. The estimate for 2015 was 683,487. So that's a drop of about 20 or 30,000 victims, something like that, from the year before. So a slight drop in victims. That's good. We'd have to do some more analysis to know if that's truly a significant drop. But, you know, just eyeballing, you can see there's a drop. Majority of victims consisted of 3 races. Once again, 43 white, 23 Hispanic, 21 African American. That is basically unchanged from the year before, percentage-wise. The average number of children that suffered from neglect rose to 75%. Physical abuse stayed about the same. So that means that a few of the other types of abuse, aside from physical abuse, let's say like sexual abuse, emotional abuse, things, probably went down. and neglect went up a little bit. Neglect went up about 10 percentage points. It estimated that we had about 1,300 children die from abuse and neglect, so that is a drop, and that's good. And more than one half of the perpetrators are still women, and just a little under half of perpetrators are still men. Those numbers are pretty consistent from the year before. 78% of perpetrators were parents, which is consistent still, and 1.9% were unknown, which is a little bit of a drop. The Texas data shows that we had an estimate of 63,781 victims. That's about the same as 14. Our breakup is about racially is about the same as the year before. Our data aligns with the national data as far as the types of abuse, about 75% neglect. Our physical abuse was a little bit less, so I think you can kind of think about what is the split up of the types of abuse that were reported here. We may have had more types of abuse reported here than other states, besides physical abuse, because our neglect lines up pretty close to the national number. We had 162 deaths reported, which is still the highest of all the states and a few more than the year before. We have 44% perpetrators were men and 55% women. That's pretty close to the national average still. And 77% were perpetrators. That still aligns with the national numbers and the year before. And once again, less than 1% were unknown to the victim in Texas. So Texas was comprised about 9% of the victims in the U.S. So we dropped a percentage point in all reports. You know, once again, we'd have to do some in-depth statistical analysis to determine if that is actually a significant drop. But you know, it's there. It's a visible drop for us just looking at it. So once again, we did have double the percentage of Hispanic victims in our state as opposed to nationally, and was our largest reported group. We still comprise about 10% of all fatalities, and that is still the highest number of any fatalities reported. So let's talk about the differences between the Texas data and the national data. We know what the differences are. Let's think about what the causes of those differences are, and then once we think about the differences in the causes that cause what causes the differences, then we could talk about how we can focus our support and educational efforts in the state to increase resiliency and to prevent abuse and neglect. We can also do this by thinking about the types of maltreatment, and then we want to talk about how we can use this information in our roles supporting matches. So I'm going to open up the speakers now. If you have a lot of background noise going on, you know, just go ahead and mute yourself. So, let's talk about the differences between the Texas data and the national data. So the things that we talked about were that we have the highest number of percentage of reports, the highest percentage of deaths, and we have a much higher percentage of Hispanic victims than the national data does. So what do you guys think about that? What factors in Texas do you think lend to those numbers? And you guys can type in the chat box too if you want. I'm going to start calling on people if nobody answers. Hollywood says that one factor is that the population is larger here than in most states. Absolutely. So that would kind of naturally lead us to have more reports, right? Anybody else want to chime in on this one? Another thing that I want everyone to consider as far as our reports is also to keep in mind how well referrals are screened in and out. I think ideally you would have the exact same criteria for screening out across the country, but that is not the case. So we might screen differently here in Texas than they do in another state as well. We might screen more cases in than we do screening out. That could definitely lead to that. Also, when we're looking at deaths due to child abuse or neglect, we can also look at the fact that the way those deaths are reported, they could be reported more accurately in Texas than in other places, which also might cause us to look like we have more than other places. Certainly, us having a larger population is just going to be the main factor of that. But I want you guys to think critically about this and think about the fact that our procedures and processes and policies in our CPS programs here in Texas can also contribute to this, not just population. So so thinking about all of this and thinking about the fact that we have a high number of neglect in our state, we have a high number of Hispanic victims in our state. What do you guys think as far as how we could focus our support and educational efforts through the agency? Do you guys have any ideas on that? Once again, you can type in the chat box if you want to instead of using the microphone. Okay, I'm going to call on people. Oh, Holly's chiming in again. Thank you, Holly. She says give information out about parenting classes. Absolutely. I don't know how many of you guys give parents information on parenting classes, but it doesn't hurt. If you don't, you can look up, I mean, it's pretty easy to Google parenting classes in DFW or whatever area you happen to be in. But there are child and family services in a lot of areas. So child and family services is one thing that you can look up in your area, and most agencies that provide child and family services will provide parenting classes. Also, when you go to the Texas Department of State Health Services, so Texas DSHS, I like to call it DSHS, they have some references for that. It's basically just individual agencies and people who have registered as parenting educators with them. Yes, Jackie, offer bilingual resources and education. Absolutely. It's very important to offer bilingual references and education. Once again, Texas Department of Health has they have a lot of resources that are offered bilingually. Pretty much all of their child welfare resources are offered both in English and in Spanish, and that's because the state has recognized the need to educate our Spanish-speaking parents in the state. So if you guys especially, you know, the federal government website, childwelfare.gov, has a lot of resources, and they do have some in Spanish, but the Texas website has a heck of a lot of resources in Spanish. I think even more than the federal website does. And a lot of it's on parenting, just healthy parenting ideas, things that increase parental resilience. Sarah asked, would other classes and resources such as anger management, substance abuse, and stress management help? Yes, absolutely. Because we're talking about so we're talking about neglect being a huge issue, right? So mostly what leads to neglect is parents just not being resilient and being overwhelmed and not being able to take care of that kid properly. Very often because they are in poverty, very often because they are uneducated. Yes, substance abuse leads to neglect cases for sure, where the parent is just not available because they're busy using a substance. And stress management is a big deal. I mean, certainly stress management and anger management lead to abuse, outright abuse, but they also lead to neglect, because a lot of times when parents get angry or stressed out, they're going to, you know, just not want to deal with the kids and leave the kids on their own. So those things can all help, and just parental resilience in general helps prevent all of this. And that's really looking at them having proper support, having being emotionally healthy, managing their stress. Once they do all these things, then they can be available to their kids both physically and emotionally, because they can't really take care of their kids or increase their kids' resilience until they've taken care of themselves and ensured their own resilience. So yeah, those are all, yep, great ideas, guys, on that. So we've already talked about some of, we've actually already talked about some of the protective factors, education being one of the protective factors that, that we can promote. What are some other, do you guys know what some other protective factors are for preventing abuse and neglect? So we named one, which is parental education. Another one is awareness. This is why we do NCAP month, and we talk about it, is because awareness of abuse and neglect is actually considered a protective factor. You know, kids and people in general are not going to report things if they don't understand it. Let's see. So here's another protective factor. What do we do when we are interviewing kids and orienting them to the program? What is one thing that we go over with our kids that we're considering for our programs that we want them to make sure they understand and can discuss with us? Yes, ma'am, Gracia. Safety. Knowing that, and when we talk about that with the kids, we're talking about what is safe, what's safe for them, and what's not safe for them. Also, the kids understanding safety and knowing what's good and what's bad for them, understanding the difference between nurturing touch and harmful touch, and weird touch, uncomfortable touch. Understanding all of those absolutely, those are protective factors. So there's another thing that we do with our volunteers that's a protective factor. When we bring them in and we go over this with them, definitely in PMT, and you guys probably also go over it a little bit when you're orienting volunteers, when you're interviewing them and things like that. What is something that we go over with the volunteers as regards to child safety? Anybody? What we specifically teach what do we specifically teach our volunteers to kind of look at for child safety? Do you guys know? I know you guys have. Yes, making sure how they know to keep them safe for sure. What are some, but that's not what I'm specific, that is true. But not keeping secrets, yes ma'am. Here we're getting towards it, yes ma'am, not keeping secrets. And then what else do we teach them? There's like one other thing that we teach them, Gracia, when they go through PMT. And it's actually a whole big list of things. Yes, communication with parents. You're hitting everything around. You're hitting everything around it. So I'm aiming at one of the things that's actually considered like really a protective factor is people understanding and recognizing the signs of abuse, and understanding how to report it. Those are actually considered protective factors. It's on the list of protective factors. So some other protective factors are promoting self-worth and self-confidence in kids, which I think our program does in general. I think our bigs are pretty good at that. So that's a great protective factor that we hit. And other protective factors are having proper support. So we are a type of support in our agency. Some other types of support are like community support similar to us. So like we already talked about child and family centers. There's religious communities that are good supports. There are federal supports, like governmental supports. So talking about things like early childhood intervention programs, the Lone Star program, where they get food assistance. There are programs that offer assistance with utilities and paying bills. There are programs both offered by the government and by community agencies. These are all things. And then just emotional support. So that's once again, so I mentioned religious organizations as physical supports, but they're also emotional supports too. And then we have community counseling centers. The child and family centers often offer not just education, not just physical support, but also emotional support, because they'll have groups for parents and counseling available as well. So these are all protective factors. So what do you, how do you guys think you can use this information, talking about the trends and everything? So one big trend I want us to recognize is that every year the reported cases nationally go down just a little bit every year. And this has been the trend for like the last 15 years, which is good. So I think that's good to keep in mind. And then also just keeping in mind the differences between Texas and national data, and keeping in mind that neglect is the largest maltreatment that kids suffer from. So how do you guys think you can use this information in your roles? Sarah, I'm going to pick on you specifically because you have a different role than everybody else.
Hello.
Hi, and I think yours is specifically, I think your role is very tied to this kind of stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I don't know if everybody knows what I do, but I do a lot of outcomes and grant reporting, and so I think just showing how our program helps how it helps. What's the word I'm looking for? How our program can help these statistics continue to go down.
Yeah, I think our program helps promote child resiliency for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think, I mean, another thing is we help prevent very directly in that we kind of keep an eye on what's, even trend-wise, we keep an eye on what's going on with matches in a different way, kind of an overview way, more than like just match support does. So we look for like trends.
Yeah.
That might not, you know, where things might not be good. I know one thing that we do in particular, which is kind of tracked and reported by your position, is the when they've got a whole lot of hours spent together, you know, and we look at like, you know, gee, why, you know, what's going on here? I mean, that could be preventative because there could be something not healthy going on there. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Okay, one of my match support specialists. Oh wait, somebody just typed in. Let's see what they said. Oh, Summer, yay. Okay, so Summer says, I think just raising awareness in general with volunteers and family members is part of her job as an enrollment specialist, because a lot of people assume that abuse from strangers is the most common. Yes, just like we talked about earlier. And when we talked about how it's actually like 1%, and they don't understand how to recognize signs for neglect or the danger of it. Yes, absolutely. And I think specifically, Summer, people are very unaware of the signs of neglect because I don't think they think about, like, I don't know, they might not take too much notice of a kid being unusually hungry or smelling funky or wanting being reluctant to go home, you know, things like that. They might not generally think of that as anything unusual, but it's that there's signs of possible neglect. Yeah, or being sleeping in school. Yeah, I mean, exactly. These are not things, people might notice them, but they might not tie that to, like, they may be neglected at home. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as an enrollment specialist, even if you don't ever enroll even those people don't even make it into our program, you're making an impact on preventing child neglect and abuse, because those people get, you know, the people that at least for sure make it through PMT to that far in the process learn about those signs of abuse and neglect. Yeah, so. Yeah, it's raising awareness just in general. Okay, one of my match support specialists chime in, please. Enrollment's chimed in. Let's see if match support can chime in. Or anyone who supervises match support specialists. Okay, Jordan, you have a different role. You're CR. What do you think about this in your role?
Darn. I knew you were going to call on me. Well, for me, it's a little different because I never interact with the kids, and I don't do a whole lot of interaction with the volunteers. Actually, I mostly talk to references and that kind of stuff. But I think it just gives me a little bit motivation to speak out some of our red flag behaviors.
Yeah.
That tend to weed people out anyway, but and just report those to the enrollment specialist, and continue to help keeping our kids safe.
Right. So it just helps you to be a more effective another layer of screening. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Erin says, I think that it's good information to pass to school liaisons like counselors to help look for signs too. Absolutely, because you know, you guys that are school-based end up talking to your school liaisons, and the school liaisons very often see the kids more than you do. They kind of, or if they don't see them, like they kind of like know what's going on with them, because it's like a counselor. It's kind of part of their job to kind of overall kind of there's kids struggling or whatever. It's usually brought to their attention. Yeah, absolutely. It's very good to educate the schools. I think we all assume that people in schools should be educated in the signs of abuse and neglect, but I don't know that that's always the case. I think that's a poor assumption for us to make. They are educators, and that is their main role. And yes, because they work so closely with kids, they should be educated in recognizing and reporting neglect and abuse. But I think depending on the school and the school district, the level of attention that's paid to that can vary. And it always is helpful for us to be another voice in that, because you guys know we do hammer on this a lot. You know, I think we are far more worried about child safety than maybe almost any other organization in the U.S. We are very, very focused on child safety. Aside from people that's literally like all they do, you know. So aside from organizations that are purely child safety advocates and educators, I think, you know, for an organization that just interacts with kids, we are far more aware and promotive of child safety issues than most are. And you can see that when you look at other organizations that work with kids, and how much less focused on safety they are, and how many more issues they end up having with their volunteers that interact with kids than we do. So, yeah, awesome. Oh, Veronica's chimed in. She says on her end as an MSS, helping volunteers to look for patterns and recording them is important, yes. And also to help them ask the right questions to get information without leading the kid. Absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely important stuff. Probably how it affects you the most, for sure. And you know, understanding that neglect is most prevalent will help you to kind of probably be more sensitive to that when you're talking to all of your match parties. And also when you're educating your bigs, you know, so yeah, really you just directly take this stuff and you pass it on to your bigs, and they learn, and they kind of figure out, like you'd said, with your help, on exactly how to address these issues, because we don't want to lead the kid, for sure. That just complicates things. We want to get accurate information. So yeah. Also of note, guys, I have another training coming up on the 27th. That is understanding child neglect, and that one is targeted at bigs. I did it last week too, but I'll be doing it in a week as well. So you know, send your bigs my way for that training if you want, if you think they would think it's helpful, because we'll talk about, we go into a lot more depth into like what causes maltreatment, specifically neglect. We go into a lot of detail on the outcomes from kids that are abused and neglected. We go into a lot more detail on resiliency and how to prevent it, and we also talk specifically about reporting, kind of like what their obligation is to report, and kind of talk a little bit about what the process is like with them and their match support specialist or partnership specialist, and you know, just to kind of go over that in case they ever are faced with the issue. So, all right, well, that's all we're going to talk about today. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Here's the resource. You can see it's just the child maltreatment reports, and they are on, you can find those on the government websites. Honestly, the easiest way to find the maltreatment reports, if I have those in PDF, if you guys want to email me, I could send it to you if you really want to see the whole report. You can also Google it and just put Child Maltreatment Report 2015, and a link to the PDF on the government website comes up. It's real easy to find. I also want to bring your attention, guys, to the materials section. PDF of today's presentation is available there so that you can keep all of this for your reference. You just click on that link and it will allow you to download it. So if you guys don't have any further questions or comments, then we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you for being patient with my funny sounding voice. All right, thanks very much for attending, guys. Have a good day.